I am the 43rd keeper of the Andreval archive. Predecessors left me their notes, their trembling marginalia, and the one sealed chamber at the end of the eastern corridor that none of them opened. They left me this post the way a parent leaves a child a house with one locked room. Not with instructions, but with the clear expectation that a wise inheritor will leave the lock alone. I was not for most of my career wise, but I am wise now. I want to be plain about that before I explain what I found, what I read, and what I chose to do with the reading afterward. I am wiser now than I was when I first stood before that iron resin door. I am wiser than I was when I finally opened it. I am perhaps wiser than any living archivist in the current galactic census, though that distinction is not one I sought and not one I enjoy. Wisdom of this particular kind is earned the way scar tissue is earned, not by the event itself, but by surviving it long enough to understand what you survived. The Andreval archive is the oldest continuous repository of stellar cartography and contact history in the outer concordance. Predate the concordance itself. We predate 2 of the 3 civilizations that founded it. There are shelving corridors in the lower vaults, where the cataloging language has not been spoken aloud by any living mouth for 11,000 standard years, where the record tablets are sealed in preservation resin, so old it has turned from amber to black, and where I am the only archivist cleared to enter, not because of rank, but because there is no one else left who holds the training lineage required to read what is stored there. I am not boasting, I am establishing context. When I tell you that the sealed room at the end of the eastern corridor unsettled me on sight, that the iron resin door carried a particular texture of institutional dread that I had never encountered in 51 years of archival work. I want you to understand that I have handled documents that describe the extinction of 47 civilizations. I have read in the original press notation the last transmissions of the Gavari Compact before it ceased. I have cataloged the silence. I do not unsettle easily, and I was unsettled. The door itself was unremarkable in dimension. It was the sealing method that stopped me the first time I put my hand on it. Standard Andreval archival seals are layered. Bureaucratic authentication over ceremonial authentication over physical lock. You can read the seal tier markings the way a physician reads a wound. How deep, how deliberate, how long ago. This door had been sealed at a depth I had never personally handled. 11 separate authentication tiers. The outermost 3 were concordance standard. The next 4 were older, pre-concordance, from the era of the founding synod. The kind of institutional language that treated information as something that could injure the reader if improperly handled. The innermost 4 tiers were something I had to spend 2 days in the lower vaults identifying. They were written in primordial Andreval, the archival dialect used only when a document was considered hazardous, not merely to the individual reader, but to the stability of any civilization that read it. I had found primordial Andreval seals twice in my career before that day. Once on a record of pre-collapse Gavari genetic experimentation that had been sealed on the recommendation of the Concordance Medical Council. Once on a map fragment from the early survey era that depicted a corridor of space since redesignated as a permanent exclusion zone. A map that, I later confirmed, had been sealed because 3 separate survey vessels had followed its coordinates and none had returned. The third instance was this door. I cataloged the seal tier markings over 2 days. I brought no assistant. This was a decision I made without fully articulating to myself why. Only that the door felt like kind of a subject that became more dangerous with each additional pair of eyes brought to it. I worked alone. I documented everything in handwriting rather than a recorder, on physical notation stock rather than a data lattice. When I was finished documenting the exterior, I locked my notes in my personal security cabinet and sat at my desk for a long time without doing anything at all. Then I opened the door. The room behind it was smaller than I expected, 7 meters by 4, with shelving on 3 walls and a single reading table bolted to the floor at the center. The shelving held approximately 200 sealed document cases, each tagged in primordial Andreval, each sealed at no fewer than 5 tiers internally, on top of whatever had been applied to the outer door. The air that came out when the door opened was not stale, it was cold. Not the cold of a room that had been closed for a long time, but the cold of a room that had been deliberately kept at a temperature below the archive's ambient, as though whatever was stored there had been judged to require refrigeration of a kind that applied to information as readily as to organic matter. There was a single document case on the reading table. It had been placed there intentionally, separated from the shelving, as though whoever had sealed the room had wanted to ensure the next reader, whenever that reader came, would encounter this particular case first. I opened it. Inside was a document packet of medium thickness, perhaps 300 sheets of notation stock, pressed in the style of the early Synod era. On the cover sheet, in a hand I eventually identified as belonging to Archivist Primary Sovenal Rect, the 21st keeper of this archive, there was a single annotation. Rect held this post approximately 4,000 years before my appointment. The annotation read, in primordial Andraval, "What follows is the complete record of the Tharuvek incursion. I have sealed this room not to protect the record from destruction, but to protect those who might read it from acting on what they learn. If you are reading this, I trust you have the judgment not to act. I did not have that judgment. 17 of my predecessors did not have that judgment. Act, and you will not return. Do not act, and you will carry this the rest of your life. I am sorry. I sat at that table for a very long time before I read further. The Tharuvek were, at the time of the incursion, the dominant military civilization in the outer concordance's 4th quadrant. They had been a member state of the concordance for approximately 6 centuries, and, in that time they had expanded through 31 star systems, absorbed 2 lesser civilizations through what the diplomatic record calls consensual integration and what the honest historian calls conquest, and built a military apparatus of genuine sophistication. I am not being dismissive of them. The Tharuvek were, by any reasonable measure, formidable. Their fleet technology was 2 centuries ahead of concordance standard. Their command culture was disciplined, hierarchical, and genuinely effective. Their historical record, prior to the incursion, reflects a civilization that had never suffered a significant military reversal. This is relevant context. The incursion was not the Tharuvek's idea alone. The record in that sealed room is thorough enough. Recht was a meticulous archivist, and the documents he compiled included intercepts, council minutes, and the debriefings of the 3 beings who survived. And what the record shows is a coalition. 7 civilizations, 5 of them concordance member states. Tharuvek provided the primary fleet, approximately 1,200 vessels, the largest single military deployment in the concordance's history at that time. The others provided secondary fleets, logistical support, and intelligence. The intelligence is where the record becomes most instructive. The coalition had spent 40 years gathering data on the sector they intended to enter. 40 years. They had used long-range observation platforms, spectral analysis from maximum safe distance, pattern modeling of approach vectors, and the testimony of the Vel Oranthi, the oldest member state of the concordance, a civilization so ancient it predated the current galactic epoch by such an interval that even our best chronometry is uncertain about its founding. The Vel Oranthi had been approached because they were the only civilization in the concordance known to have had direct contact with the inhabitants of the Forbidden Sector in an earlier era. The Vel Oranthi, when approached, did something that the council minutes record with evident confusion. They refused to contribute intelligence, refused to contribute vessels, and refused to attend any further planning sessions regarding the incursion. Their ambassador's final statement to the council read, according to the transcript, "We have answered this question before. We will not answer it again. We will record that we advised against this action and that our advice was not taken. We ask only that, when the record is sealed, our objection is noted. Their objection is noted. I noted it again, in the margin of Recht's document, in my own hand when I read it. It seems important that the note be renewed. I spent some time, in those days in the sealed room, trying to understand what the Vel Oronthi knew. Civilization predates every other member state of the concordance by an interval that most concordance historians describe as vast and leave at that, because the honest answer that the Vel Oronthi were already ancient when the civilizations that eventually founded the concordance were taking their first steps beyond their home systems carries implications that are uncomfortable to sit with for long. They do not speak frequently about their early history, but they have shared across 4,000 years of concordance membership amounts to a carefully curated set of impressions rather than a record. Stories shaped more by what they omit than by what they include. The archival record of the Vel Oronthi's early-era contact with the Forbidden Sector, if such a record exists, is not held in the Andraval archive. I have queried the Inter-Archive Network twice in my career on this subject. Both times the response was the same: no accessible record. Whether that means the record does not exist or exists and is not accessible or exists in a form that Vel Oronthi institutional practice does not define as a record, I cannot say. What I can say is that when a civilization that predates the current epoch declines to discuss what it knows about a particular region of space, the correct archival interpretation of that silence is not absence of knowledge. It is the most deliberate kind of presence. The coalition proceeded without the Vel Oronthi. They had 40 years of data. They had 1,200 vessels. They had a military culture that had never suffered a meaningful reversal. They had, as the council minutes show in language that does not age well, assessed the inhabitants of the Forbidden Sector as a civilization of considerable but bounded capability, formidable in their own region, the assessment read, but not of a kind that would present an insurmountable challenge to a coordinated, well-resourced, technologically superior deployment. The Tharuvek fleet crossed the boundary on a date recorded in Rect's documents as the 14th day of the third cycle of the year, concordance designates as 4.441, entered the Forbidden Sector in 3 columns, standard combat spacing, full sensor arrays active. The 2 supporting coalition fleets entered at separate approach vectors 40 minutes later, as planned. There are, in Rect's compiled record, exactly 3 first-person accounts of what followed. Three beings returned from the incursion. One was Tharuvek, a signals officer from a vessel that was, by the account, positioned near the outer edge of the 3rd column. One was from a secondary coalition fleet, a navigation officer who described vessel as having been caught in a sensor blackout and having turned back before fully entering the Forbidden Sector. One was a concordance diplomatic observer who had been embedded in the coalition command structure and who survived aboard a shuttle that had separated from its carrier vessel before the carrier vessel ceased to respond. I have read all 3 accounts. I will not reproduce them in detail here because Rect's judgment, expressed in his prefatory annotation, holds. Acting on what they describe does not produce good outcomes. What I will say is this: the signals officer's account occupies 41 sheets of Rect's notation stock. Of those 41 sheets, the first 4 describe the crossing of the boundary and the initial advance. The next 3 describe a period of sensor anomaly that the officer was unable to interpret, readings that did not correspond to any known spatial phenomenon, communications blackout across the entire fleet, a quality of silence in the sensor feeds that the officer describes, in language that still carries the coldness of genuine bewilderment, as the silence of a place that is aware of you. The remaining 34 sheets are almost entirely redacted, not by Rect. The redactions are older than Rect's compilation. They were made by the signals officer herself before she submitted her account in ink that she mixed with something that has made the underlying text permanently irrecoverable. 34 sheets of self-redaction survives in the margins of those redacted pages, in a hand noticeably different from the officer's account handwriting. Shaking where the account hand is steady are 3 words, repeated in the Tharuvek primary script at irregular intervals across all 34 pages. The words translate approximately as, "They were already there." The navigation officer's account is shorter, 12 sheets, detailed and precise, in the manner of someone reporting a technical event rather than a witnessed catastrophe. She describes the sensor blackout, the decision to turn back, the transit back to concordance space. She notes that when her vessel crossed back over the boundary, all sensors immediately resumed normal function. She notes that in the moment of the blackout, before the decision to retreat was made, her vessel's passive receivers captured a signal on a frequency that her equipment was not designed to monitor, and that she had never heard before. She describes the signal as resembling nothing so much as a counting sound, regular, patient, unhurried. She does not speculate about what was being counted. She does not need to. The diplomatic observer's account is the shortest, 7 sheets. The observer had been a career diplomat, trained in the concordance tradition of precise unemotional reporting. The account reads that way for the first 4 sheets. Factual, chronological, stripped of affect. The last 3 sheets are different. The last 3 sheets were written, the observer notes, 3 years after the events described, because she had been unable to write about them until then. In those 3 sheets she says only, I did not see what destroyed the fleet. I want to be clear about that. I saw the fleet. And then I saw the space where the fleet had been. I want to be clear that there was no interval of combat between those 2 observations. There was no battle. There was no engagement. There was the fleet, and then there was the space the fleet had occupied. And in that space, where 1,200 vessels and their complements had been, there was nothing. No debris, no energy signatures, no distress signals, no bodies, nothing. The sector consumed them and left no record of having done so, and I think that was not an accident. I think it was a message. I think the message was, there is no evidence here because we chose to leave none. We want you to understand that we could have left evidence. We chose not to. Do not mistake the absence of wreckage for an absence of capacity. Understand it as its opposite. The observer's account ends there. 7 sheets. The last paragraph I have quoted verbatim, because it is the most precisely articulated statement of the incursion's meaning that exists in any surviving record. And because I believe Recht's instruction, not to act on what the record contains, does not preclude the record being understood. Understanding is not acting. Understanding is, if anything, the best argument for not acting. The Tharuvek did not survive as a civilization. I should be clear about the mechanism. They were not destroyed by retaliatory action. The Forbidden Sector did not send a fleet in response. There was no counter-incursion. What happened to the Tharuvek was more patient than that. The coalition that had assembled the incursion collapsed within 2 years. Not from external pressure, but from internal fracture, from the particular kind of institutional failure that follows a catastrophe that cannot be explained or assigned a cause. The Tharuvek's military apparatus, which had been the civilization's central organizing principle, had lost 1,200 vessels and their full complements without a single piece of recoverable intelligence about what had happened. Military cultures require explicable enemies. The Tharuvek's enemy had declined to be explicable. The civilization that followed, reduced, reorganized, renamed, no longer exists under any designation in the current concordance census. They are a notation in the historical record. They are a reference in Recht-sealed documents. They are a lesson. The 5 other coalition member states survive, in various forms. None of them have, in the 4000s since the incursion, proposed any action regarding the Forbidden Sector. Their public records are largely silent on the subject. Their internal records, where I have access to them through inter-archive agreements, are sealed at levels similar to Recht's room. I have not requested access. I believe I have read enough. The Bel Oranthi, the ancient civilization that had refused to participate and had asked only that their objection be noted, did not comment publicly on the outcome of the incursion. They issued no statement of validation. They made no reference to having warned the coalition. Their ambassador to the concordance, in the period immediately following the confirmation that the Tharuvek fleet had not returned, delivered one communication to the council. The communication was brief. The transcription in Recht's documents reads, "The boundary stands. It has always stood. There is nothing further to say about this, and we will not be saying it. That communication was delivered 4,000 years ago. The Vel-Oranthi have not in the 4 millennia since made any additional statement regarding the forbidden sector. They do not need to. I sealed Recht's room again after 3 days of reading. I added 2 authentication tiers of my own. One in primordial Andreval, one in a personal cipher I have registered with the Concordance Archival Authority as my institutional seal. I replaced the selected document case on the reading table in the position I had found it, because that position seemed to carry intention. Whoever first placed it there wanted the next reader to encounter it first, and I saw no reason to disturb that arrangement. Before I closed the outer door for the last time, I wrote a brief annotation on the inside face of the door frame. In primordial Andreval, in a hand I took care to make as steady as I could. The annotation reads, 43rd Keeper, I have read, I understand. The room is resealed. 44th. Read Recht's prefatory note before you open the cases. He wrote it carefully. He meant it. I mean it too. Then I locked the door. There is a protocol in archival practice called the preservation burden. The principle that certain information is better maintained than destroyed, because destruction creates the kind of absence that invites speculation, and speculation, unguided by record, tends toward action. Preservation burden holds that the archive serves civilizations, not by telling it what to do, but by ensuring it has access to what has already been done and what resulted. The forbidden sector has its own version of this principle. The sector is not empty, it is not abandoned. It is not, as some of the less careful theorists in the concordance academic census have occasionally proposed, a region of unusual natural hazard. It is a region that has made itself understood to the civilizations that have approached it, and the understanding it has conveyed is this. The line exists. The line has always existed. True. The civilizations that treated the line as a challenge to be overcome are no longer available for comment. I am writing this account now, not because I believe it will be widely read. I am writing it because Recht's annotation asked me, implicitly, to add my own understanding to his. And because I believe the value of an archive is not in the accumulation of sealed rooms, but in the occasional witness who has read what is in them and chosen to pass the reading forward in a form that does not require the next witness to open a sealed door to find it. Let them find it here. Let the sealed room remain sealed for the keeper after me. What I know, having read, is this. The forbidden sector is old. Whatever watches from it is older than the concordance, older than the Vel-Oranthi, older, the evidence suggests, than the current galactic epoch as most civilizations reckon it. It is patient in a way that is not passive. Patience that has never been required to become impatience because no challenge has been sufficient to require a response beyond the one response that leaves nothing behind for the challenger's successors to study. It does not advertise. It does not warn through spectacle. The 1,200 vessels of the Taravek incursion received no warning, no ultimatum, no demonstration of force. The sector simply noted their arrival, and then their arrival was undone. I have been an archivist for 51 years. I have read about the endings of many civilizations. Most endings have evidence. Most endings have a record of struggle, of resistance, of the particular noise that accompanies the collision of two forces against each other. The Tharuvek incursion has no such record. 1,200 vessels entered a sector, and the sector continued to exist as it had before they entered, except that they no longer did. The observer's word is the right one, not a battle, a correction. The sector corrected an error and left no trace of having done so, because a trace would have been an explanation, and an explanation would have invited analysis, and analysis, in the sector's apparent judgment, was not what the situation called for. The situation called for was silence, and silence was what was left. The boundary stands. The archive is sealed. 43rd Keeper has read, and will not act, and will not speak of this again. The sector does not require my silence. It has never required anyone's silence. What it has always had, and what it will continue to have, long after the Andreval archive has become one more notation in whatever record system survives us. Is the silence that follows a question answered so thoroughly that no one asks it again? That silence is the oldest document in this archive. It was here before the first shelf was built, before no in stock was pressed, before the first keeper placed a hand on the first door and understood that some rooms are sealed not against intruders but against the kind of curiosity that cannot be survived. It will be here after the last one of us is done.